that it was a bunch of debaters. So it makes more sense. I'm going to stop talking now. Goodbye.
Okay, we're on.
Do we just begin? Are we?
I will let you know when I've got the link I can send to everyone, and we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait until some people join.
Fair, don't mind. Happy to wait. Shams, so do you want me to run through those points I had? And if so, how quickly? And then you'll take over the slides?
So how much time do we have?
50 minutes until the hour mark, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to say, yeah, you have until an hour, like the 7 o'clock. Yeah.
So we have an hour. So Tex, maybe we should do 15 to 20 minutes each max, and then whatever's left. I'm saying 15 to 20 to give us both space, and then whatever's left is Q&A. Should we just do that?
Geneva, in your experience, because has anyone done like a Q&A bit yet? Because sometimes with these things, you get like a lot more questions than you expect, but it takes a while for people to warm up. And in a way, if we have a good audience and they have loads of questions, I'd rather do that. But then if the audience is kind of quiet, then yeah, we should talk for a bit longer. Do you have a sense of?
So at this morning's one, sorry, Geneva.
No, I was going to say Jack did this morning, so he'll be able to tell you.
Yeah, there were a decent few questions, like 3 or 4, and they came in after around the 15, 20-minute mark.
Can't hear Tex.
Sorry, Juanita was asking one of us to join for the equity briefing. I sort of noped out of that one. Okay, well, hopefully we'll have some questions then. And then,
yeah. So let's just do 15 each then and end at 30.
I would also say, I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to see the words questions, but I would just like encourage people to do it in the Facebook and then say that you'll be able to get them and then we'll send them through as they come.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I'll just shamelessly plug and be like, honestly, you know, when are you going to get to ask questions like this and get answers immediately, you know? So
you've been talking these workshops up, Tex. I'm going to be very disappointed if they're not like incredible.
They might not be, but they'll still be better than the alternatives. Sigh. Ah, well. Charles, maybe no one will turn up. Maybe no one will like even know who we are or care. That'll be really fun.
It is possible that people are just like, we want to go to bed.
I mean, it's entirely fair, to be honest.
Yeah, because at this point, all of Asia is probably asleep, whereas they would have been alive in the earlier time slot. But if we're recording it, I think we're okay.
We have 18 viewers.
Oh well, now.
Hello, you 18 people. All right, I think it sounds like we can start. So hello, everyone, 18 unnamed people who are watching us, hopefully more by the time I say this. So my name is Teck Wei, and I'm one of the equity officers, but prior to that, I also did some debating for various institutions, and I was one of the DCAs for Career Worlds last year. Shams was around since I was a school kid, so I'll let Shams introduce her debating CV.
Hi, I'm Shams. I do some coaching. I did some judging. I also did some debating. So I'm excited to join Tex here.
Yes. So what we're going to do, I know it's late for some people, so thank you very much for coming. What we're going to do is each of us have prepared some thoughts on the topic, just by extensions. And then we'd like as much of it as possible to be interactive. So there's an opportunity to ask questions in the live stream chat, which will be passed on to us by other people on this call. We really highly recommend you do that because there's nothing more boring than just getting talked at. And so, we'd like to make it a bit more interactive. And I think it's also a great way to help you deal with the specific things you're working on, because very often it's easy to give general feedback, and general feedback is helpful to a point, but once in a while it's good to talk about some specifics. So you're going to hear from me, and then you're going to hear from Shams. So let's kick off. So the first thing I will say is a very shameless plug. So I have given a workshop on extensions before, which I personally no longer remember, and I suspect I was probably far worse at debating then, but people have told me that it's helpful. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, I would recommend you find a video from the EUDC 2017 academies, and the title of that video on YouTube is "Picking and Selling Your Extension." People have said good things about it to me, so I hope it's useful, and that there is some benefit to starting from there. But what I did want to do is put together some of my more recent thoughts on how to think about and approach an extension, because obviously in any debate, it's so different when you're thinking about extensions. It depends so much on what your top half has done, who the stronger teams are, but I think there are some guiding principles. So the first guiding principle to get better at extensions, and this sounds really simple and dumb, is just to know more arguments. And the reason should be quite obvious, right? The more arguments you have, the more ideas you've thought about and bounced around with other people, the more likely it is that your mind will hear something that's being said and it'll go like, hey, I think we could say that. Now, the question, of course, then becomes, how do you know more arguments, right? If it was like a sports drink, everyone would just kind of chug those down before a round. And I guess my advice to know more arguments is to spend some time in debating, not just thinking about the arguments you did make, but try and speak to other people about the arguments they've heard in other rounds, whether that's good speakers, judges, it could be everyone who's been at that tournament and done that debate. There's likely to be some interesting perspective there. And I think that's one thing we have lost a little bit with online debating. I'm not sure how we compensate for that, but it used to be that at socials and stuff, you'd have everyone get very obsessed with debates, and they would continue to talk about it. They would continue to think about the clever arguments they heard, what was wrong with them, how to fix them. And to the extent that if you are going back to offline debating, try and do that. But even if you're back online, see if there are ways you can do that. Because I think when you stop caring so much about the result and start thinking in your head or with your partner or with your friends about those arguments, it's more likely to stretch that muscle of how quickly you think of an argument after the fact. So that's point number one. Very important, but hard to immediately get better at. So what are some more obvious and simple things we can do? The second tip I have is to have more debating skills, because the more skills you have, the more arguments, the more types of arguments you can make. And it's very fitting that we've just finished a round on esports, right? Because this is very much a video game concept. If you level up to a certain point, you learn how to wield a sword or something, you can now swing that sword in a particular way. It's exactly the same in debating, because lots of speakers are good at some arguments and some things, but they will be weak in others. So a very common one is some speakers just can't get economics arguments, right? And that's fine if all the rounds are about social progress or about culture or about art. But sometimes there are debates where the top half stuff is maybe about culture, it's about softer principles, but there's a beautiful extension about economics, about finance, about money. And if it's something you're not just weak at, but you've got no confidence in yourself to make that argument, you might think of the right argument. Your partner might tell you, hey, you should run this argument. But if you've not built up that confidence, you're going to really struggle to, when push comes to shove, quarterfinal of a big tournament, commit to doing that. And I think it's the same with all kinds of skills. So some people are very skilled at explaining very complex philosophical ideas very simply. That means that in some debates, you can run an extension well, even if it's very philosophical. It might be to do with illustration and storytelling. There's some speakers out there who are excellent storytellers, and that means that when they run an extension around human emotion, around human reactions to some very powerful, visceral things, they can get away with it more. And so I encourage you to think about your debating skills and argumentative skills as this toolkit, right? And have a think about what you're not so good at. Have a think about what kinds of extensions or what kinds of arguments you struggle to prove. And the more of those tools you have, the more likely it is you'll be able to run an extension that comes to mind, or that you will even think of it in the first place, because there's a good chance you'll be familiar with those concepts just by spending time thinking about them, reading about them. Cool. The third tip I have is to strike a balance between what can I prove and how important is it. So one of the big errors we often see is speakers will say, this is like the biggest impact I can think of. It's going to be great. And if I can prove this, then I'm going to win the debate. But what if you can't prove it, right? Because judges are going to be very discerning and kind of balancing those two things. What have you proven and how crucial is it? But equally, I sometimes see speakers do the opposite, which is be too conservative. So they think, well, I can prove this bit and I'm going to try and prove that, but I guess it's not much, right? So if you've ever felt like, oh, I guess I've got an extension, I don't know how it beats opening, that may be the camp you fall into. And I think sometimes that's because we ourselves think, oh, that's all I have. That's not very important, is it? And so I have a story. A long time ago when I was a wee child, I did there was this big national exam, and then I got a score of the numbers don't really matter, but it's 273, which is historically a good but not great score. And my parents were very disappointed. They said oh, it's only 273. And then I turned around and was yeah, but the top scorer in the year was 276. So it's only 3 marks less. And that actually cheered them up quite a lot. So for those of you Asians out there, you'll know how impressive that is. I think there's a very real story kind of lesson in that, which is very often debating is not necessarily about proving some wild, fantastic things that will change the world, especially in extension. Instead, it's about reminding the audience and the judge that the world is a hard place to make better. The world is a tough place. The world is not as good as we'd like it to be. And so by managing expectations, or by giving a bit of context about how the world is, you can make an extension sound way more powerful. So you avoid getting that reaction from the judge of is that it? And counter that by basically showing that it's really quite impressive. It's really quite cool. And we can talk through some examples, I suspect, at some point. Tip number 4, another common mistake I see. When teams feel like they don't have a winning extension, they try and hedge their bets, right? Eggs in one basket and all that jazz. And what that means is actually they end up splitting the time of 7 minutes into 3 somewhat interesting but not very detailed arguments, right? Because they've literally split their time up. And that is almost always counterproductive. And the reason for that is if you're forced to run an argument that's a little bit more complex, a little bit less obvious, it's going to need more time, right? Complex arguments just obviously need more time. It requires more things to prove, and you need to talk a judge through it, and you need to compare it to your opening as well. And so it's almost like this psychological habit of thinking, well, I might as well try a few different things. Very rational, in most areas of human life, that makes sense. But you actually need to fight that instinct quite a lot. And if you're going to run an extension that's, tough to prove, but potentially very, very useful, if you do it right, you have to really commit. You have to mentally as a team agree, we're going to double down on this. This is the best bet. We're going to do everything we can to prove it. Because ironically and counterintuitively, doing anything else other than that makes it less likely to succeed. Okay, so that's 4 tips so far. Plenty of time. So I'll go to tip number 5. A good extension should try and beat their opening. And in order to beat your opening, you have to compare yourself to your opening. And one thing I see lots of teams do very badly, and it's the same issue with the phrase, oh, we're going to take them at their best, is that you say that, but you don't actually do that, and kind of misquote the Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I'm not sure it means what you think it means. So I think when you're trying to compare to your opening half, it's always advantageous to try and be as generous as possible with what you're crediting them for. So don't try to at least immediately try and knock them down and show that they're wrong. You can come to that later on, but try and genuinely take everything they've claimed and find a way to explain why your extension is more important. I know that's kind of, again, easier said than done, but I think only by trying to do that very hard thing in almost every debate will you build up that muscle. One of the things I see with lots of speakers on the circuit now is they're often finding very, what I call nitpicky ways, very technical ways of showing that they're better. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it can be helpful, but it doesn't build up the muscle of training yourself to explain why a concept, an idea, an impact, an outcome is just bigger, it's just better. And that's actually a really important life skill, which do you a lot of good in the future. And so when you're comparing yourself to your opening, the judge has to feel like you were fair, has to feel like you've given them a fair shake, given them the best chance they had before you go ahead and beat them. Tip number 6 is again another one I'm hugely passionate about. I might even have left like a comment on Sirius posting or something, but the best way to run the best extension is to give yourself as much time as possible to figure out what needs to be said, right? You want to say the right things. Now, there's some people I know who start writing their extension speech in the prep time. That's a bit extreme, but I have seen it. That's rough. What if your opening takes that stuff? What if someone else runs it better than you can? So most people then start writing their extension during the Prime Minister's speech or the Leader of Opposition speech. And again, when you go up against the truly best Deputy Prime Ministers or Deputy Leaders of Opposition, you'll find that they start adding lots of material in their speech. And very often you might feel like, oh my gosh, they've taken our stuff, there's nothing left. So how do you deal with that? Well, the piece of advice I'd have is as an extension speaker to try and get better at giving your extensions while writing as little as possible. Right? Because if you can write as little as possible, in fact, in an ideal world, if you could write nothing at all, just go and give the extension, that means you're listening all the way to the end. You're listening for what the top half is contributing. You're thinking about why it's relevant, irrelevant. You're thinking about why it's good, it's bad. And that means you can fit what you're saying into the context of the top half. So you can be like, that's a flaw, and I'm going to fill in that flaw. Now, you might not even have realized it was a flaw if you weren't listening to them in the first place, frantically writing your extension. And so being able to write less and listen more is extremely useful in extension speeches, just by virtue of the fact that by being a member of government or a member of opposition, you are the only speaker who literally has to change almost all of your strategy immediately, right? No other speaker in BP has to do that. And so very, very useful skill there. Finally, the last one is just to judge more debates. If you are speaking at this tournament, well, have a great time. But after you're done, if you want to get better as a speaker, I would highly encourage judging a bit more, especially if you can judge with good judges at big tournaments. It's always more fun to speak, and I get that, but a couple of judging workouts will be a good investment. And the reason for that is when you begin to learn how a judge thinks and talks about a back half team, it really helps you plug in those gaps. When you've heard a good chair say like, oh, I don't think they proved that, it builds this habit in you to think, okay, when I'm running it, have I left any of those gaps? Have I done everything to make it really clear? And so you begin to prioritize some of the things that judges look out for much, much more. Cool, those are the tips. Not a big fan of lecturing at people for a long amount of time. So what I will now do is hand you over to Sham, so you can listen to a different voice and different perspective. And again, I hope we'll get some good questions from you guys and we can have a good chat there. So Sham, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm less spontaneous than Tex. And I will share with you a lecture that we used to deliver. Oh, wait, I can't share my screen. Can I share my screen from the hosts? So when debate tournaments were still happening on site in the before times, I was on the CA team of WUDC 2019, and we had a training program, a tie-up with world universities at that time. And so I am going to be delivering bits of our lecture on extensions from that training academy, from the training program. Can I get permission to share the screen? But I'll keep going anyway, so we don't waste time. I just wanted to credit Athens and Thailand Worlds. Okay, so what are we usually told? This first part reinforces a lot of what we've gotten from Tex already, right? What are we usually told about extending? First, that closing teams do not win through minimal additions, right? But to the extent through which their contribution, including the summary speech, is meaningfully better than what has come before. So ultimately, different and new is not enough, right? It needs to be important, and you need to make that clear to the judge. So I have some suggestions of like general directions or strategies you can take. But before that, just some notes on prep, right? Never rush into arguments in prep if you're a closing team. I understand there's a bit more urgency if you're opening. One way to start might be to identify all the burdens of proof that exist in the debate. So what are the things that each side has to prove to win, right? And if there are many burdens of proof, how likely is it that opening will prove all of them? If there are few or just one main burden, what are the links needed to make this argument stand? So that's kind of where you focus your prep. The goal is not to have a case ready going into the debate, because that case, most of it will probably get taken up by your opening team, right? It's about having a shared strategic understanding of how the round might play out, or the multiple ways that the round might play out, that allows you to make effective decisions and efficiently communicate during the debate. So what you're trying to do in prep is ensure that when the round starts, you are in a better position to make these quick judgments, right? Or to make this extension. So don't expect any prep material to necessarily survive opening, and be prepared to change what your extension is by deputy. Okay, let me see if I now have the power to share. Yes, I do. Very good. Cool. All right. Now, just a quick note on speaker roles as well. You're extending as a team. So remember, the team member, so the extension speaker, must bring the bulk of the extension out, right? So you're introducing it, you're explaining why it's important, you're putting out all the main logical links and evidence, you're discussing the comparatives, you're engaging with top half. You might not be able to do all of that right away, or all of that in 7 minutes, and whips need to be mindful of that. So you're plugging those gaps, and you might have to do like additional selling of the extension, additional impacting, additional weighting versus other arguments, right? So if your extension speaker put all the material out there as soon as they can, you as a whip speaker may have to be like, oh, maybe they didn't sell enough how important this was, so that's what I'm gonna have to do. Maybe they did a lot of link work, but they didn't do a lot of impacting. So you're working as a team here. And obviously, as a whip speaker, you listen to your partner in detail, because you need to do the strategically most effective thing given your partner's speech, right? And obviously, if you're closing gov, just take note, you're the only one who gets a go at closing up, so don't forget about them. All right. So there are several types of extensions, and I've kind of just like tried to categorize them. It's obviously extensions don't fall under such neat categories, but this is just kind of useful in terms of being conscious of which track you are primarily taking in a round, right? Opening a new clash. Sometimes, I mean, people think that this is the only way to extend, but it's not. But it's obviously the easiest way to appear new and fresh to the judge. But obviously, this is hard to do when you have a strong opening team. And besides, a new clash does not necessarily mean a winning clash. It might be trivial to the round, right? But if this is, where you want to go, the strategy would be to prep wide and broad, have various ideas for directions to go. And usually you're doing a mix of all these strategies because you're hedging during prep time. When do you use this? I mean, your side is winning all the clashes, right? So you prove your material, and then you prove and weigh your clash versus the clashes already in the room. This isn't always possible, though. So next strategy is extending an existing clash. Again, you can combine strategies, right? Pros. I mean, this is strategically valuable or necessary in shallow or very, very focused debates where you can't like make up new clashes, because it's quite a narrow debate, right? So what are the cons? It is a hard type of extension to prove your freshness with, right? And it's hard with a strong opening team, because what else are you going to say? Now, how do you strategize for this in prep? You prep the central clashes in depth, focus on strategic meta. Why is your analysis necessary? And again, as Teck says, you be as charitable as possible to your opening, because judges would have tracked what they said, right? So you can't get away with misrepping them or undercrediting them. When do you do this? If your side is losing one or more clashes, but you think that is what needs to be proven in the round, then you go and try to win that clash by extending on it, right? What are the questions you answer in this situation? How is this clash not settled for my side? How does my material settle this clash? If other clashes exist, why is this the most important one? Why is this where I'm investing my time? That also applies to the first one. Next strategy, and this one is a bit riskier, weighing existing clashes, right? So pros, you're not really generating new material per se. There is a risk of sounding like a non-extension. So what you do here is, if the top half teams are not very good at impacting or like weighing up material, or they've been really non-comparative, you can introduce clear metrics or criteria by which a debate should be adjudicated. And so if there's a lack of engagement in the opening half, so how do you do this? How do you pull it off? You show a lack of engagement, make sure there actually is a lack of engagement. You can't just claim that. And then you provide a metric upon which you think the clashes should be weighed. Why is this? And then explain why this metric is necessary. And then apply the metric to your bench and show why your bench is winning. I mean, I've seen this succeed in some situations, especially when top half is very, very information heavy and sometimes very fact heavy, that they're forgetting to engage with each other. Another possible strategy to take is a responsive extension, right? I mean, pros, very good for making sure you're at least beating the other bench. Cons, it requires some courage to pull off. It needs very explicit impacting. And obviously you're being compared to your opening, and they will then be seen as potentially having more material that stands at the end of the debate, or that's still central to, I guess, driving the direction of the debate, or that you'll be seen as potentially still relying on their material to be effective. So the strategy here would be to focus closely on the other side in prep, come up with responses to their strongest material, focus on the meta of the debate, on inflating challenges from the other side. In some cases, if your opening team is really good, it kind of helps to inflate challenges from the other side, because it also subtly uses that to bring the opening's position into question, and then kind of positions you as the team that is addressing the challenges from the other side. So what you do here, spend a lot of time talking about what the other side established, why you've defeated them so far, and or how that threat is bad for your side, and how you are going to be dealing with it, right? How are you uniquely responding to it? How does your answer defeat the other team's claims? So this one kind of just buttresses a lot of what Teck said. Having an extension is not the same as winning with it. So new material is a starting point, but not an end goal. And here, I think a lot of stuff here Teck's already said. Why is your extension winning, regardless of what's happened already in the debate? And this is useful when you have a strong opening who hasn't really been challenged by the opposing teams. All right, I'm not going to go into the example because I'd rather take questions from people at this stage. So yeah, this is 10 minutes.
Yeah, so for everyone who's watching, if there's anyone watching, do you guys have questions or even examples from the rounds today or a different round? Like, it might be an interesting one to work through, just because I think it's a very abstract topic and there's nothing on the live chat except Andrews, Turku, hello. So yeah, if you guys have any thoughts, questions, if you're watching this, say something. Otherwise, Charms, I might suggest if no one has an example, I don't know, what's a good way to kind of illustrate some of these concepts? Okay, doesn't look like any questions. I mean, given that this is probably going to be recorded then, and primarily for those people who'll be watching asynchronously, Shams, how do you feel about spontaneously discussing the emotions we have seen today?
Sure, I am not judging at this tournament, so you may have to take the lead here. I don't even know what the first round motion is.
Well, there you go, that's ideal. I don't have, yes, so someone drop the motion in, please. So I can't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it is about in disaster-prone areas, South Police and government, there we go. In disaster-prone areas, this house would replace all state rebuilding and reconstruction efforts with direct cash transfers to affected citizens. And let's pretend we're CG, because that's often the toughest position. Oh, there are 2 questions on Facebook. This is very exciting. Do not see any of those questions.
Not on the Facebook Live, actually.
Yeah.
How do you know what is important?
How do you convince a judge your weighing is more important? I am going to go first and posit my answer. I think it's pure marketing. It's pure like politician drivel. And that's why debaters make such terrifyingly good politicians. Because the truth of it is, some things can sound really dull and unimportant, and some things can sound really like the most important thing in the world. And I think the reason it's so tricky to do that is you need to have some understanding of like human, I wouldn't say psychology, but just almost human nature, right? Getting a sense of what people innately care about and whether you're feeding into something someone already cares about, or are you going against something? And if that's the case, is there like a thought experiment? Is there a prompt that might make you? So here's an example from like quite a while ago. So it might not be the sharpest, right? But let's say you're running a principal extension. Oh, the mythical principal extension, which some people seem to get away with despite being crap. Let's say you're running it well, and you've got a good reason for why privacy is really important in a debate, or rather, why privacy is infringed in a debate. Maybe it's about meta or something. How do you show that privacy is the most important thing in the round, right? So maybe some teams have made arguments about benefits and stuff. I mean, this is where like a thought experiment can be very helpful. So one of the classic privacy arguments is, if what's wrong with like people having your metadata about where you've been or where you've gone? In fact, you get paid for it, right? And if I said to you, like, what if I offered you £50 a day? So not a huge amount, but not insignificant, I guess, £50, $100, whatever. And in exchange, you'd have this like guy in a black hat and like a suit follow you around with a tiny little notebook and make little notes about your whole day. You don't really know what the notes are. Yeah, so they might be critiquing your like fashion choice, the food you ordered at lunch. They might be taking note of like how many steps it takes you to walk from your house to like the bus stop, maybe like how many buses you take. You don't know what it is, but you just have this little guy following you around with a little notebook. Would you really be willing to do that for like £50 a day for the rest of your life? I mean, sure, some people might, but I genuinely think it just sounds much more creepy, right? And that is what Facebook is doing, or whichever app, behind the veneer of a very well-designed, colorful user interface. Now, sure, you get something out of it, but you're getting something out of it either way. And that's the kind of thing which really begins, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it begins to help you make something that previously sounded very trivial sound quite scary, quite spooky. And it's really playing on, what am I playing on there? Well, I'm partially playing on like horror movie tropes of this like stalker following you around, right? Like it's trying to take something that you're naturally afraid of and helping you relate that to that. So that's not the only way to do it, but that's an example of what I mean when I say it's just marketing, but equally it's a skill, and it's something to try and work on. Shams, I don't know if you've got any examples.
Well, I agree with Tex, right? One thing I will say is sometimes debates are not always about out-metricing each other, right? Because sometimes teams will agree on what's important. You'll agree on what the standard is for judging the debate. And that happens more often than you realize, actually. And so when that happens, the debate is really just about showing which side achieves that criteria or meets that criteria better. Another option is sometimes it might actually be useful to try to adopt on the other team's metric or try to beat them on their metrics, right? Rather than insisting that there has to be a different metric by which this debate will be judged. So that's the more abstract advice in general. The next is I would agree with Tex, really. A lot of it is about intuition pumps, and it's also about being more exposed to debating and developing a sense of like what the not within debating, but like what individuals prefer, what the conception of the good life is, and what is seen as like bad normatively. Debate is not as assumptionless a world as we think. I think, given the debates I've judged, that there seems to be like, practical consequences and utilitarianism seem to be an effective anchor. So if this if this is something that's easier to prove on your side, you must leverage it, right? Like you must anchor on it. So conceptions, and some of this also involves just being exposed to different like philosophical frameworks and conceptions of what the good life is, I guess, conceptions of what an ethical life is, and being able to defend that if you're dealing with more principle-based motions, or if your side calls for that. Obviously, the easiest way is always to connect it to practical consequences. I'm sorry, but I think your average B or C judge is more likely to latch on to that argument. And since my role here is to tell you how to win, that always works, right? Which policy saves more lives? Which policy minimizes suffering? Which policy saves us more resources? Which policy is better in the long term? Are usually quite popular metrics, and sometimes because intuitively people tend to lean into these metrics more, you kind of need to do a little less analytical work in proving them. But obviously, if your opponents are good, they'll call you to task, right? And they'll challenge that. Tex, Do we want to move on to the second question?
I actually had something to add to that, actually. So I was watching like a critique of a piece of like video game media or something, and this guy was talking about how there are some statements about value that people agree on those facts. They just fundamentally disagree about how to, so for example, you might look at a movie and think, I hate that movie because it's cheesy. And someone might say, I love that movie because it's cheesy. And the truth is, you can try and debate, but if that's someone's value position, that's how they see the world, you're never really going to budge them, right? Like you can try, and that's why I think going back to what I was saying earlier about the privacy example as well, that I think it's very consistent with what Shams is saying. It's always more powerful to find something that someone is likely to already believe in on some level, that they already resonate with, right? So, I'm going to kind of touch on a little bit of that question there about like focusing on one particular victim, right? Because that's a very common strategy. Pointing out a smaller group matters more. And I think most human beings just by default have the more is better. So more people help, that is better. Fewer people hurt, that is better. But that's not always the case. And I think each of us have our own, in certain situations, intuitions about like, actually, I really care about this. I really care about this cause. I really care about this thing. And I find some reason for that. And I think that's why I see a lot of teams try and make like weighing by being like, here are 3 reasons why my weighing is better. But you can't always persuade someone rationally about values. You have to find a part of them or a sensible way of like tugging on that value, identifying how people see the world. Anyway, so that's just my little add-on to that, to kind of help everyone realize you can't persuade someone to see the world differently. You need to kind of show them that that actually they're already to some extent on your side, and all you're helping them do is realizing where they might not have otherwise realized that what you're caring about is actually what they care about as well. And this is, again, what politicians do all the time, right? Politicians do not come out and say, here is my idea for how I will make society a better place. They do, but it's always couched as, on some level, you already believe this, you already want this, and I am the person who will give it to you. It's a little bit, but that is how this skill does work.
I'll speak quickly to the victim, identifying a specific demographic as an extension. It absolutely is an extension. Whether it is a winning extension depends on the debate and depends on how you've pulled it off, right? And there are several ways to go about this. The more classic formula is what's good for the greatest number of people. You're able to demonstrate that you win. What if you want to show that there are disproportionate effects on a particular group? You have to make that case well, right? So, and I think some of the ways in which that case can be done well is to show that historically a lot has been extracted from this group already, or that other people's happiness, other people's prosperity in some ways is subsidized by the suffering of that group already historically, and then enter this new policy would worsen that suffering. And then perhaps to show that the cost to the majorities is not as great as the cost would be to this group, and then to do that particular way up, perhaps to talk about precedents as well and show how it can be made worse. So I think an extension can be won by showing unique impacts on a particular group, but it has to be done well, and the way up has to be clear and explicit. How do you convince a judge? Oh, sorry.
Can I pile on to that?
Go.
Sorry. It's the energy is flowing now. This is great. So I presume whoever asked that was asking about the first debate, and I actually have a sense of how to flesh that in, right? And it's actually putting the flesh onto the things Shams has talked about, because I think one possible extension about that is we're going to focus in this debate about the small group of people who could not, to use an economics term, liquidate their assets, who could not like turn whatever they owned in these disaster-prone areas into cash and then use that cash to head off. Maybe that's because it was a job and it was a short-term job, they couldn't save enough money. Maybe it's because it was a house they couldn't sell. Maybe it's like that's where all their belongings were and they couldn't afford to transport it somewhere else around the country. We're going to focus on that group and only that group. And then no extension is purely about, very rarely is it purely about some abstract value, right? So for those people in that first motion, you're giving them cash. And previously they had this life they'd built. They couldn't take that life and shift it somewhere else, even though they really, really wanted to. But now they got that cash and they've essentially sold their previous life. They managed to turn the resources they had, which were very fixed, which were very static, which were very geographically, kind of stuck in that area. They've now got something they can take with them, right? Because money is easy. You stuff some cash in your bag or you put it in a bank account. Now, why do we really care about this group? Why do we really care about the fact that they can now build their lives somewhere else? Well, because people should be allowed to kind of pursue a better life, right? The whole pursuit of happiness, like stories, movies built on that, is the fact that if you think you can do something better elsewhere, you should be free to do that. You know best for yourself. It's something very noble, powerful, aspirational, about that Will Smith movie. If you've not watched it, you guys are quite young, so you might not have. And what's holding them back? It's the fact that the stuff they owned was linked to an area that they knew would geographically kind of get destroyed again and again and again. It doesn't matter if the government builds their house back. That house is always going to get destroyed every 2-3 years. They know that. There's nothing they can do. That's terrible, right? So one of the big almost premises, one of the big like values we have in why we love a free country, the freedom to choose in a free market, is so people can go at it and take those risks and do what's best for them. And they couldn't do that until now. So it doesn't matter if opening government, opening opposition make arguments about like bureaucracy and who gets better contracts. Like, what's a better bridge really going to do, right? The bridge is going to stand, it'll be a bit narrower. You drive your car down, it'll be a bit more of a traffic jam maybe. But we're helping, maybe it's just like 1,000 people. We're having 1,000 people escape, literally being trapped in that area, and that is life-changing, right? So that's obviously a way I'm trying to tell you that story. It's not the only way to tell the story, but can you kind of see how that victim, that very small group, doesn't actually sound so small anymore? They sound quite powerful. They sound quite important, right? They sound like something that you and I would care about. And yeah, so I think that's again just an example fleshing out what we've described to be like, if you can do that, then proving the argument is almost the easy part. You prove that, and then you focus on this to help the judge really see why yours is more important. So hopefully that helps.
Last thing on that, sorry. This one I'm going to abstract again. I was not at the debate, right? One thing you could do is, if there are metrics that seem more obvious or more straightforward, there are ways to signal to the judge that they shouldn't be so easy for the other side to prove. So the metric that majority rules, most people want it, most people voted for it, you have to make clear to the judge, it shouldn't be that easy for prop to get away with just claiming that, right? You can say, but why? Like, we question why it has to be this way. Like, it's historically this way, but why must it be this way? So at least make it harder for the other side to prove what appears to be on face quite intuitive, right? There is a question here. Well, Tex, do we want to go to the notes question, or if you have more input on previous questions, just go?
Yeah, I think we've covered that quite from different angles. I think it's quite thorough. And actually, I think that might even be more useful than any of the things we first said. Like, I think just breaking down a real case study. Let's talk about the notes. Actually, I think that's a good one.
To be honest, one thing that really worked for me was having a very conscious note-taking scheme, like having a set of symbols in the way I take down my notes and shorthands, and like really knowing. I know this sounds a bit, and this isn't gonna work for everyone, but like I use a lot of arrows and colored pens. So red is for rebuttal, blue is for my own responses. I mean, red is for what they're saying, blue is my own responses to it. Like, know what size of paper works for you. This seems a bit basic, but you'll have to go through some trial and error to find out what works for you, right? Like what paper size, what shorthands you use, making sure your notes make sense to you and your teammate. So like some prep work there is also useful, because usually sometimes when I'm like, I need to write the extension, can you listen and feed me responses? And so you kind of have to understand, like, working through a communication flow between you and your teammate. You understand their writing, you understand what words mean when they hand you the sheet of paper. There is usually, 10 seconds before you have to get up and speak, like when the other speaker goes to sit. Maybe that doesn't happen really online, but then that would be the time my teammate and I would be like frantically talking to each other, and teammate would be like, this is what you must say, because I used to be the extension speaker and I had a whip speaker help me out, right? So a lot of it is really just practice and working that out. The other thing is, writing things down is sometimes like a safety net. It's like a security blanket. People are like, oh no, I need to write everything down because I might miss stuff and I won't respond. But actually, it's not the security blanket you think it is. Sometimes it helps to just like sit for a while, listen, and then just write down the strongest bits of analysis of the argument. Basically, it's distillation, right? It's gist, the bit that you really have to take down for you to win in the debate. Don't write down the pieces of evidence that they're giving unless it's like particularly crucial to the case, or unless you're going to show that it's a poorly chosen example, right? Or flip it. But you try to distill it when you summarize. And that way you're forced to actually engage more, listen more, right? a lot of this is practice, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess my answer to that is listen as much as possible, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how beautifully executed your argument is. If the DPM touched on it in the last minute and actually it hit all the spots, it's not gonna fly. It's such a tough one. I guess I think everything Sham says it makes sense, and this is again not something that you can immediately do overnight, but it's something to aim for, which is, if you have a clever extension idea, you have a sense of how it's going to win the debate, and your friend like at the social or whatnot comes up and it's like, so what did you guys try and run? And like, if you've ever been in that spot of like, oh, I had something really clever, I was, you're excited to talk about it, and you just talk about it naturally. You don't think you're in a debate, you just talk. If you can do that, if you can explain in a few lines or 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, however long it is, this story, this grand thing you were trying to achieve in your head, that's all you really need. Because if you can just take that, it might not be the best speech ever because you didn't have time to write it out. But if you have that story, this plan of how you intend to win the debate, and you talk a judge through it, even if your notes are terrible, you'll be surprised just how I've always felt my best speeches came when all I had was this picture in my head that I was figuring out, and I was like, okay, I think this is the picture. This is what we're going to go for. I'm just going to talk about it normally. I'm not going to be reliant on my notes. Sometimes you write too much as well. You feel the urge to say everything you've written down, and then you like, what was that? I can't read my handwriting. Whereas actually, when you're very little down on your paper, you almost like recalling it from memory. And I know that is really hard and really stressful, and not something I would recommend you do like tomorrow in round 3 unless you feel really good about it. But that's why I think the most important skill is to judge more debates, to talk about debates more, to build up this ability which comes over time to be like, oh, this was the strategy, and then this is how we tried to deal with it, and this is how we fit in. The more confident you are about that, the more you'll be able to listen as much as possible. Good question though, really good question. Do we have any more questions from the group? I guess something that might not always work because it depends on the judge, but it might be interesting to ask a judge, especially if you think they're a good chair, what they would have said and how they would have said it. Because often when I'm judging, I find myself listening to that top half and I'm already thinking like, oh, it'd be so fun to say that. And actually judges do write those things down, and you might as well, they've seen the debate, you might as well. And the beauty of it is you don't even have to be in the back half. If you're in the top half and you just want to get better at it, just ask them and be like, by the way, did you think, yeah. In a situation with a very strong OG, weak up bench, the viewpoint character being the mediocre CG, is a strategic focus on showing how the Gov case as a whole reliant on the OG beats up bench.
I'm just going to add one thing to that. So, okay, in that situation, I think your first aim is to really take down op, ideally with unique rebuttal and unique responses to them, right? That's the first thing you need to get done well. Because if you get that done well, you lock yourself at second at least. So make sure you're not recycling the responses of OG and that you build on them, because that's the best space you have to actually contribute, right? And so that's aiming for a second. To aim for a first, though, here, you cannot simply rely on OG case a bit too much. Like, you need to kind of try to add on to it and extend on bits or try to open a new line of clash if there is space to do that, but I doubt, right? But this is the best hedge, I would suggest. Make sure that there are unique responses to op.
Yeah, so it's just for everyone's benefit. The question was, when there's a strong OG, a weak op bench, and mediocre CG case available, should you focus on how Gov wins as a whole, even if it's reliant on OG, or what else? So I agree with Shams. Like, first thing you want to do is just make sure you have new stuff. Just like make sure you have new stuff. And you know what I think sometimes people need to remember, and I again learned this the hard way. Sometimes you just can't win the round. Like sometimes. Like I've been in CG with like some of the best speakers in the world, and we have lost to other very good speakers, but in a position where we just couldn't have done anything about it. Now we tried. We had our lottery ticket, so to speak. We were like, I think this might work. We'll try it out. But mentally, as Sham says, we were okay. We know this is the position we can guarantee ourselves. We're going to do that. I guess, was there anything new I would add to that? I don't know. I think that the key to what has been discussed is like always give yourself as many chances as possible by having new things. Right? Because if you have something new, who knows? Maybe the judge is bad. Maybe the judge actually thought OG was quite shit. So the important thing is not to have to have the things you know what you're trying for, rather than resign yourself to not having them at all. How do you extend a really good top half when they have captured the most important essence of the debate very well? It's a tough one. So one is they might have captured the essence, but have they explained it in the best way? This is again very debate specific. So if you came to me like I don't know, debate that I'm weak at, like some sort of social movement thing, I would not be able to add more to that. But if you came to me with a debate about, I don't know, the Lego company or some other thing I was passionate about, there's a good chance someone might have captured the essence. We could say a lot more. The other thing you could try and do is I don't want to say lie, but almost like recognize that there is no real such thing as the essence of a debate. Like one of my pet peeves is when people say like, they necessarily have this burden, and like, beyond the motion being the motion, there's no like God CA team that says like this. In fact, if there were, there wouldn't be so many broken motions out there, right? Because CS would just dictate what the class should be. The truth is, once a motion's out there, it's up to you to figure out a way to make something core seem like not so core anymore. And again, I know without examples, it's a bit hard. If you have an example that's in your mind, throw it out there. Maybe we can chat about it. But I would challenge you to not see that as static. Yeah.
I agree with Dex. I would disabuse myself of this notion that a top half has successfully captured the most important essence. There's always a depth versus breadth trade-off also. If they hit so many issues, you're like, oh my God, they've covered everything. They've burned so much ground. There is probably a depth trade-off there. So look at the links that have not been proven very well and insert yourself and say, this link was so crucial to this argument working, right? Or if then they have gone in much depth, perhaps there's stuff that's left out. There's always space, I think. And maybe they made the case, maybe they put a lot of material out there. Perhaps the weighing or the impacting wasn't done very well because maybe they ran out of time. Like, it's just impossible to run a perfect case in 14 minutes with 15 in 40 minutes with 15 minutes to prep. So there is something you'll be able to find. I'll jump to the last question, Tex. How would you weigh principles against practical impact? So I can't give you a formula here, but one thing I will say, so in terms of weighing principles against practical impacts, is these are not neat categories that are distinct from each other. It is possible to illustrate the practicality of principles. Of course, it's a skill to be able to discuss a principle in its own terms, but even the right to privacy, right? Let's see this whole like privacy versus security debate. So clearly the security argument is, oh, we're protecting a lot of people from possible attacks, from, I don't know, from theft or whatever. And on the prop, you're like, oh, but people's right to privacy, their ability to feel safe, to feel secure, to self-actualize are important. But it is so easy to point to specific situations where abuses are very, very likely. And the practical harms could exist on a scale that's comparable to what the other side is saying. So I don't like thinking of things as pure principle and pure practical, because in reality, things are both, is my short answer there. If Tex wants to add something, just, yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, a lot of what teams claim as principle is either applied ethics, where applied being the key word, you can apply it to a situation, or a lot of principles are just trying to convince someone else that there's something else valuable in the world, rather than, and because of that other thing that is valuable, a certain course of action is also valuable. Very rarely in debates will there be a principle that is purely an intellectual discussion. And in those debates, I suspect all teams are making principle claims. Almost all teams will be tussling on that. So it's not a case of like, I've got a principle, you've got a practical. Those might be debates about like jurisprudence or about political science and what countries should do. That's where there is a bit more of a pure, what is correct, what is right, what is legitimate. Classic debate about whether it's legitimate to target civilians or whatnot. Or, that there is a pure principle angle there, but it's easier to stake that ground basically. But that's one that people have different opinions on, and it also depends so much on the case you're making, how well you're making it. It's a good question. If you've got specific examples, again, I don't know about Shams, can't speak for Shams, but I'd be more than happy to, whoever you are, if you have an example, message on Discord, we can chat about it. I think it'll be fun. But that's the short answer. Cool. So I think that is all the time we've had. We've had a surprisingly good time. So, thank you very much for staying and engaging. I'm sure it's quite late for some of you. If you're watching this recording, enjoy. I hope it was useful. And farewell, I suppose. And I'll hand the time back to the training officers.
All the best for the tournament.
Okay, we can probably end the stream.
Yeah.